Awesome. We'll begin. Greetings and welcome everyone to the Global Black Studies Native American Heritage Month 2022 webinar. I first want to give honor and thanks to the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation, on whose land we as faculty, staff, and students at Western Carolina University are guests. This year, our webinar is titled Red Power in the Black Panther, Radical Imagination and Intersectional Resistance at Wounded Knee. And it is a conversation with Dr. Louise Siddons, Professor of Visual Politics and Head of the Department of Art and Media Technology in the Winchester School of Art, University of Southampton. And I want to say thank you for joining us today, Dr. Siddons, and I'm so happy that you accepted our invitation to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me. I was thrilled to get your invitation, and I'm looking forward to the conversation immensely. Yeah.
Awesome. So I want to begin with a general question about your training and your specialty that led you to pursuing this particular research topic for a scholarly journal article.
Yeah, well, it could be a long story or a short one, but it kind of starts. So I was born in the UK, where I am now, and then my family immigrated first to Canada and then to New York when I was about 5. And so in some ways, I grew up American, but in other ways, I always felt a little bit like an outsider. And when I went to college, I thought, how can I figure out kind of Americanness, I guess? And so I started studying American history and art history specifically, because I did a lot of art as a kid and I was interested in kind of the visual. And I have to say my sister was a women's studies major and a poet. And she's a little older than me. And so she was like, you should take a women's studies class. And that kind of set me on a track of being interested in kind of the stories that weren't told, I guess, in history, right? And she was really lucky. She got to work with people like Toni Morrison, amazing writers and kind of feminists. And so she kind of pushed me in that direction specifically. So I became a women's studies major. And in some ways I was like, well, women's studies classes, I mean, I have to say I went to Cornell and they were fantastic. I don't want to sort of diss women's studies at Cornell in any way, but it was like white women's studies, kind of like white feminism. And I was like, okay, so I made this argument, and I was lucky because it was a really loose program at the time, that I was going to supplement the women's studies classes that were officially women's studies with other classes like Africana studies, which was an amazing department. Some incredible people were working there while I was there. Latin American studies, Chicana studies in particular was really strong while I was there. So I made like a basically like marginalized people major. Then went to Stanford to do my PhD and did it in art history and American art history specifically, and kind of had that same thing. And again, lucked out, if I pretended I made any of these choices intentionally, like it was always serendipity and like sort of my naive questions leading to outcomes. But the one thing that Cornell didn't do was Native American, anything really. And so when I got to Stanford, I said to my advisor, like, I wish I had had a Native American art background of any kind, because it's the real gap in sort of my list of marginalized people, if you will. And they had a visiting scholar program. So she brought in Aldona Janitis, who was the director of the museum at the University of Alaska and is an expert on Native Northwest Coast, particularly Kwakwaka'wakw art and culture. And so she came for a year, and I just like spent all my time kind of learning from her. So I had really, really strong African American studies at Cornell, and then kept doing kind of ethnic studies type stuff at Stanford, but introduced that Native American thing and started to get interested, then moved to Oklahoma, which is an incredible place to study Native American everything. Really like rich, diverse Native community because of the history of how Oklahoma got populated with 39 tribes from all over the continent. And I mean, you mentioned, right, Eastern Band Cherokee, and they're one of the biggest tribes in Oklahoma as well, kind of a split culture there, like all the 5 tribes. Anyway, so yeah, started working with Native people and living artists, and yeah, just kind of, I got interested in this idea of intersectional visual politics, where it was like, how do different groups interact, right? Like, why am I finding this constant thread between the experience of marginalization, even when the specific histories and politics are different? And how did artists throughout the 20th century sort of cope with that? So that's how I got to activist images, because you have to, when you're working in kind of an activist space in the left wing, like you have to work with solidarity between groups, right, to get any kind of traction. So the visual culture of that got really interesting to me.
Awesome, awesome. And for the students who are watching, you heard, hey, asking question leads to intellectual curiosity, intellectual journeys, and academic journeys. And that's what you all should be doing. You should be critically engaging your coursework, your curriculum, and asking questions to help shape your research projects, your research interests, and even perhaps the courses you select. So that's a nugget of knowledge for advising week, because it is advising week. Awesome. Now, I know I'm familiar, but many of our audience, live or when they see the recording, they may not know what the Black Panther was, and they may have thought we were going to talk about Wakanda and T'Challa.
Which, I mean, oh my gosh, we could, right? Like that is such an interesting sort of reinvention of this movement. And yeah, I mean, you know, I'll tell my California version of the Black Panther history, and you can tell me your Detroit version, because that's the other thing, right? And then, like, you know, I said, I grew up in New York. New York Black Panthers are, again, another story. And so for me, I guess this project that I wrote about started because I was looking at issues of the Black Panther newspaper, which was published out of Oakland, California. And I was really looking at that part of the movement where you have a group of people basically looking at the community in Oakland, which is the east side of the San Francisco Bay, and is historically like sort of the, I'm going to say like the little sister city of San Francisco. And just Gertrude Stein described it as there is no there. Like it was kind of this wasteland sort of culturally, depending on who you asked. But of course, Gertrude Stein thinks it's a wasteland, and it was actually this incredibly rich Black community. And yet totally ignored, right, by kind of institutions. And so the Black Panthers started as an organization that was really multifaceted, trying to address the lack of education, I was going to say lack of policing, but it wasn't even a lack of policing, right? It's like the sort of what we still have today, kind of aggressive anti-Black policing. And so self-protection. There were food banks, and all kinds of just like education for kids, but also kind of what we would think of as maybe continuing or adult education, kind of literacy programs. Like it was really basically the community taking itself and providing for itself, because institutions that were supposed to be providing for it were failing. And that, I think, inevitably in the 1960s became really politicized. In the sense, not only that there was some kind of activist politics, but also that the Black Panthers started to really think about, like, how can we take over the institutions that are not serving us? So it ends with, you know, people like Shirley Chisholm running for president, and kind of real investment in infrastructure that existed. So there were these kind of community services. There was a sort of working with existing political systems activism. And there was also kind of a radical activism where it really was sort of pushing back against institutions and their limitations. And the Black Panther newspaper was, they called it basically like a news service. And it was a way of building a network, right? And building a network between Black communities. So it was one of their efforts. I think media is always kind of an effort to go beyond your local and to reach a larger audience. And so the Black Panther newspaper is interesting to me because it was heavily, heavily visual. So it was creating kind of a visual narrative for a kind of resistance movement, but also an empowerment movement. So for me, I started out studying the early 20th century, and I was interested in people like James Vanderzee, the photographer, who was the official photographer of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and Marcus Garvey. And so the whole kind of Black is beautiful, back to Africa kind of community solidarity, and a rejection of kind of white America is a historical narrative that goes way before kind of the 60s, right? There's this earlier precedent, but that gets picked up. So you get, again, like a late 20th century Black is beautiful movement. And part of the visuality of the Black Panther newspaper is conveying that kind of thing, right? So it was like, it was activist imagery, it was anti-police, it was anti-establishment, but it was also pro-Black in a very important way. I feel like I got off the track of your
Oh,
question.
no, indeed. Oh, that's actually it's important. Uh, One, that's what I do with my scholarship, and I'm glad that you made that connection of connecting one the Black Panther Party, the Black Power movement to prior movements, prior Black radical movements, going back to, we could say, even in the late 19th century, but in this case to the new Negro movement era. And also it, sheds light on the importance that the independent Black press has played in the long Black freedom struggle, or the long Black freedom tradition in the United States of America and in the diaspora, going back to the days of abolitionism, of independent Black newspapers published and edited by free Blacks, going up through Reconstruction, up until we still have a few. There are very few, but we still have a few left today. Indeed. So no, I think it's very relevant and very, very, very important. Now, in this region, more of my students and more of the community of Western Carolina and Western North Carolina may be familiar with Wounded Knee, but many may not. So could you briefly tell the listeners a little bit about what Wounded Knee was and what happened there?
Yeah, so again, it's a story with a lot of layers of history. Wounded Knee is a Lakota town, and was the site of a massacre in 1890. So had become famous if you were invested in kind of American history or Native American history for being the site of this 19th century massacre. And became, I think, in the 20th century, kind of a touchstone for people who were interested in history, partly because of people like Dee Brown, who wrote Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which was a long history of American colonization and kind of anti-Indigenous actions, military in particular. And so there were a lot of different things happening in the Red Power movement, and a lot of different organizations. I mean, a little bit like sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm talking about the Black Panthers, but there were so many other organizations that were also kind of active in the civil rights movement and kind of in the radical kind of post-civil rights moment. And the same was true, like Wounded Knee, we think of the American Indian movement as like the organization of Red Power, but there were a lot of others. But because the American Indian movement, which was organized in Minneapolis, it sort of advertised itself as the organization willing to come and support Indigenous communities that needed that support. There was a very corrupt government in Wounded Knee. And so Lakota elders basically wrote to AIM leaders and said, we have this situation where basically people on the reservation are being brutally oppressed. I mean, literally, like there was violence if you tried to go against the political regime. People were being hurt and even killed. And so they said, can you come and help us? So AIM sort of brought a bunch of activists to support those elders in a kind of takeover of Wounded Knee. So they occupied the city, town, region. It's not a city, it's a little village. But they occupied it for 72, 73 days. And in the article that I wrote, I make this argument that a kind of the Black Panther gets invested in it, not because of the occupation so much, although that was the part that the American Indian movement and other indigenous organizations were interested in, because occupying is about kind of land back and a lot of the same rhetoric that we hear today or from Native activists and communities. But at the end of the occupation, the government agreed to negotiate, and they promised no one would be arrested. And of course, what happened? Like, they surrendered and everyone got arrested and put on trial, and et cetera, et cetera. And so from the Black Panthers' perspective, it was like, okay, like one of their big arguments is that justice systems don't work. And so they're like, here's an opportunity to kind of watch from the very beginning. We've all heard these promises being made. We've all read the articles about it. Wounded Knee, by the end of the occupation, had something like, I'm not going to do numbers because I never remember numbers accurately, but it was like overwhelming support for the for AIM and the Lakota community by the time it was over. You know, if like just polls of Americans, polls globally, were saying like, yeah, the feds should back down. And so the Black Panthers were like, we're going to watch this really closely. And guess what? They watched it just devolve completely as people were given jail sentences and all the rest of it. And yeah.
Awesome. Now, you titled the article "Radical Imagination and Intersectional Resistance at Wounded Knee." So then now that people have a brief background, so tell us a little bit about that radical and intersectional nature of the portrayal and covering of this debacle and an oppressive situation by the Black Panther newspaper.
So when I say radical imagination, I mean, part of that is just thinking about, we think about newspapers, I guess these days, hopefully we think about them as having kind of a political slant of some kind. But when we think about journalism, like there's still this idea that it's just like, we are telling you information. But in some cases, I mean, the Black Panther newspaper, it was a collaborative thing, right? They were writing their own articles, but they were also sharing with this radical press. So they were almost just collecting things. But the amazing thing about the Black Panther is that almost from the very beginning, Emory Douglas became their art director. And here's a guy who's a trained artist and designer. Like, he has incredible technical skills in putting together images, specifically in this kind of newsprint media format. And he hires other artists and he creates this incredibly creative visual program. And he's borrowing from the whole range of kind of American visual culture. He's borrowing from activist imagery that came out of Europe in the Second World War, kind of collage and aesthetics like that. And so that radical imagination to me is the idea of like, what happens when we put our creativity, and particularly our artistic creativity, to use kind of for a movement to make change happen. So activist imagery interests me kind of across the board. Like, how are images persuasive and how are they inspiring? And then the intersectional resistance, a lot, like people have been talking about intersectionality ever since Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, right? The idea that, like I said, I like collected marginal experiences as a student. So I'm like, oh yeah, like intersectionality is so obvious to anyone who occupies an intersectional space. It's like, this is a completely intuitive idea that if you have multiply marginal identities, then you're going to be sort of exponentially oppressed as a person in the world. But it's also like, it's obvious and it's kind of depressing, right? Like it's hard, especially as someone who occupies marginal positions, it's really hard to walk around the world being like, yep, sucks again, right? Like, yes, I am shut out of that system again. It gets really, oppressive. Um, and so I thought, I became an art historian instead of just a historian, in part because I think art is a space of hope and of joy. People talk about kind of radical joy as sort of a way to push back against that sense that you're always embattled. And so a lot of the work that I was doing early on was about kind of separatist spaces. And so this idea of intersectionality, suddenly I was just like, what happens if we work together to take this idea of intersectionality and make it about uplift, right? How and when do we do that? And I think it kind of, like I used the word serendipity earlier, like so much of my intellectual life is about luck and just keeping my eyes open and kind of being open to other people's work in a way. But there I was looking through the Black Panther, looking for something complete. I was working on a project about sterilization and forced sterilization and kind of eugenics. And I was going through looking for images from their campaign about kind of against birth control. And there was this photograph on the front cover of one of them that was, it turns out it was Frank Foolscrow raising his fist. And in his fist is this chinumpa, a pipe, a ceremonial pipe. But Douglas, the designer of the paper, has basically I think Photoshop calls it posterizing. Like he's made the image super high contrast. You can't really see precisely what's happening and what he's holding. And it looks like it, I just looked at it and I was like, oh, that's someone holding up a rifle. Because that image happens in the Black Panther all the time. Like guy holding rifle up. Yes, that's like the iconography. And then I was like, wait a second, like the words across the top saying wounded knee. This is a native image. Native American stuff got on the cover of the Black Panther. That's instantly interesting to me. B, there's this brilliant slippage between Black Panther iconography and Native American iconography. Like that's using kind of the intersectionality of the icon in a really interesting way to me. And so that's where it started in a way. And I just now I just spend my time looking for how are people sort of thinking about borrowing imagery from each other so that when you look at it, no matter who you are, you have access to the message that it's sending, right? When we just think about the number of organizations that use a raised fist to represent sort of I couldn't even tell you in a sentence what it represents apart from a kind of general, I should not use expletives in this conversation, but screw the man, right?
Yeah.
You get the message and you get the vibe without having to know what the organization is explicitly about yet. And it kind of sucks you in and makes you, at least it makes me sympathetic straight away.
Indeed. Now, when you were looking, once you came across some of this imagery and iconography in support of solidarity with the American Indian movement, Native Americans in general, did you come across other imagery to support other aspects? For example, possibly the protest and occupation at Alcatraz, or anything like that.
Yeah. Actually, one of the early versions of the article starts with Alcatraz, but it turns out it's just too big a story. I'm like, I have this 100,000 word article for you. No. So I can't remember. I don't want to promise this is true, but basically the Black Panthers, because Alcatraz was right there in the San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz is kind of when they start paying attention. And covering Native issues extensively, but they also they didn't limit it to Native American. That was not their only kind of sort of intersectional engagement. They had by by the late 1960s, they almost always had an international section.
Yes, ma'am.
Um, and so it was like, we're talking like this is a global struggle, right? Like the structures of oppression are universal, even when the details are different. What I love about the written coverage is that they always make like they do both, right? They're like, our struggle is the same, and also our struggle is different. Because I think that's something that today we really struggle with in kind of left-wing politics, is like everyone wants to hear just one or the other. Like
Yeah,
either it's all the same or it's completely different. And it's like, no, like it's both at the same time. And we have to kind of wrap our heads around that paradox in order to work together effectively. And again, it's about like you have to listen. And so this kind of really lovely modeling of like clearly the people writing up for the Black Panther stuff about AIM were listening to AIM members and saying like, okay, so like our issue is XYZ and your issue is ABC. But the problem for both, I mean, it's why I think they focus on the justice system, right? The problem for both of us is that there are these kind of political and legal and law enforcement institutions that are just failing us. Schools are failing us, you know. I mean, like on a lot of native reservations, infrastructure is a massive problem. And it's like, okay, for a lot of Black communities, it's urban infrastructure that's a problem. And in native communities, it's rural infrastructure. But hey, guess what? The problems of infrastructure are the same. Like, why are those funding streams getting screwed up and corrupted? Why are communities not getting the support they need? These are things that, like, if you keep raising the issues together, maybe get addressed. Um, so yeah, and pointing out that it's global too, that this is not just kind of a local problem, I think is really important.
indeed. And the notion of intersectionality is so useful as a theoretical framework to have that approach or to facilitate, that approach. And I'm glad you mentioned that Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term. But obviously, people like Claudia Jones in the 1950s, they were using intersectionality. She was explicit
Right.
in her case, race, class, gender, and geographic origin. Her being a West Indian who operated in the USA and then was kicked out of the USA, so then in the UK.
Mhm.
So it's just really, really, really important with that. And also, I think it's very important and interesting as well that the Black Panthers newspaper and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, in this case, they certainly practice what they preach in regards to their approach to coalition politics as outlined and suggested by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton in their book, Black Power. Uh,
Mhm.
and I speak to this because the Black Panthers supported the American Indian movement. They used the American Indian movement's voice to put truth to power in their support, and they did not try to take over or hijack or appropriate their movement. And I think it's very, very important to point that out because that was their criticism of leftist whites and what they did to the civil rights movement and what was part of the reason why the Black Power movement grew out of the civil rights movement in many reasons, but one of the reasons were in response to that paternalism, as they framed it, of
Yeah.
left-leaning whites. So I think that's very, very important and very interesting that they took that approach. Now, you mentioned their global coverage. Uh, do you feel that their ideas and constructions of anti-colonialism, and did they frame any of the American Indian struggles within that notion of anti-colonialism? Because I know they spoke of great
Yeah.
solidarity with East Asian, Southeast Asian
Mhm.
movements, obviously Africa, but in Latin America as well, and ongoing, just like their predecessors did, all of the above I stated 60, 70 years before they did, right, that we discussed,
Yeah.
but even the Irish. right?
Yeah, yeah,
He loved the Irish, and he spoke a lot about them in his newspaper in the Negro World. And I see some of that as well in the Black Panther. So I know I said a lot to answer to ask a question, but
yeah. No, no, but I'm so glad that you did because, you know, Vietnam was obviously a touchstone for everybody throughout this period. And it was absolutely like I think that in particular, in part because the US was over there kind of actively engaged in the not war in Vietnam, right? Um, it was sort of the perfect way for not just the Black Panthers, but also for AIM activists and for like other news sort of journalists and outlets to kind of point to the connections, right? Like it's kind of why is the United States even getting involved in this war in Southeast Asia that is about kind of political tensions, frankly, like to a huge extent elsewhere? Why do they feel like they can go in? The language that the government and mainstream media was using to describe guerrilla warfare and to describe kind of like the racialization that was happening of warfare tactics.
Mhm.
Um, obviously brought up echoes, right? Like guerrilla warfare brought up echoes of kind of the ways that Native people have resisted, but then also in really interesting ways, like brought up the Revolutionary War and kind of the rhetorics and the hypocrisy of these rhetorics of kind of freedom and um, self-determination that were being utterly undermined for the Black community, for the Native community. And so you get basically everyone saying like the problems at home are like the US is displacing domestic problems onto this kind of external conflict.
We live
Uh, and like they can't even address the problems at home. Why are they over there? Why are they sending us over there? Because again, right, like you have disproportionate numbers of Native people in the military, of Black people in the military, and for people like Carmichael and others, like the military itself is one of these structures that's designed to oppress, right? Like it is exploiting people who have no other resources, which I think it still does today.
Indeed.
Um, so yeah, absolutely, kind of making those connections and the colonialism, I think specifically. And it's interesting because that issue of colonialism, I mean, I have to give the Panthers full credit for being far more open-minded and kind of trying to build these coalitions than some members of the activist Native community who were just like, Black people are also colonizers and like they're part of the problem and our concerns are not theirs. And I do think like you can understand why they're saying it. But I think ultimately that kind of separatist mentality is it certainly demonstrated itself to be pretty unproductive, I think.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because that's really something that's reemerged in the last several, I would say the last 10 or 15 years, particularly maybe the last 5 or 10 years, as an obstacle for solidarity. And in fact, I posted the flyer for this event in a couple Facebook groups I'm in, and Native American Facebook groups who are basically, they have issues with African Americans, to be quite. And I was asked to join the group by a close friend of mine that I went to undergrad with, who a Native American gentleman whose family has been very active in AIM, and him himself since before him and I were even alive. And I'm not a spring chicken, but it's compounded with now another fringe movement that happens in many communities of basically Black people who aren't proud to be from Africa, and who to run away from the legacy of once being enslaved in the Americas are saying that they are the original Native Americans and the slave trade didn't happen. It's a crock of horse manure.
Yeah.
It's some BS, and it's causing a lot of tension in a lot of spaces between African Americans and Native Americans. But something else I noticed is, what you mentioned is, the notion or the reality that African Americans are too settler colonials. And my strong problem with trying to engage in the discourse with many of them in that regard is, they don't want to have a nuanced discussion about it. I mean, does it mean something that we were forced here?
Yeah, exactly.
As a result of the slave trade, that we did not want to come here, right? Does it get more nuanced when we look at, for example, the Western band of the Cherokee Nation and other so-called, this is not my language, but these particular groups use this language too, although it's a white supremacist language given upon them by white supremacists, the five civilized nations, they engaged in Black slavery. They had Black.
Right, like the civilized is because they were plantation owners, right? I mean, it's appalling. Yeah.
And that many, for lack of a better way to put it, Afro-Cherokee were former slaves, and they became citizens based upon the treaties that the Western band of Cherokee Nation signed with the United States of America, right? Because the United States, as a result of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, had ended slavery. But they continued slavery, the Cherokee Nation, beyond that. And the treaty said, well, slavery's ended in America and you have to make these people citizens, because this is not because they were good, because the government loved Black people. It was because we can't afford to take care of these poor Negroes. They're your problem. They become your citizens, and you have to take care of them or work it out, basically, right? So we got to have these truthful conversations, and that's why one of the reasons I want to have this webinar, because I think seeing these examples of this solidarity and this support and intersectionality is like a springboard. It's like the table that we can have our meal on moving forward, right? Because it's, as you said, it's counterproductive, to all of us. I remember last year in the webinar I had an Afro-Indigenous man. I've known him since I was in graduate school because we had mutual friends, although he was at another school, but Kyle Mays, and he wrote an Afro-Indigenous history of the USA. So I had him on, and he was talking about, because Afro-Indigenous people in the United States, Black Native Americans, however language you want to use, right, are a result of becoming members of the tribal community as a result of the processes we've just discussed, or because they, from intermarriage, or let's just be honest, people having sex and having kids, right? Because not everyone gets married to have kids, right? Right, it's a result. And for him, that was the case. And he just spoke about a lot of the anti-Blackness he's observed and experienced in communities that he's actually a member of, right? And even pointed out some instances of a great TV show that won a lot of awards, as it should, but it had instances of Blackness. We had that.
I mean, I think, you brought up geography earlier as kind of one of the things we have to think about when we talk about American identities. And certainly being in Oklahoma, like it's the South in a lot of ways. It's also a bunch of other places. But I think that, I mean, what I really wanted to say, apart from like, there's a lot of those attitudes that just persist, like, I mean, the tribes in Oklahoma fought on the side of the South in the Civil War, right? Like they were defending kind of the exact same property rights and beliefs that the South was, and they were absolutely being racist about it. And I think that history is really problematized by the fact that how we define identities. Like I think one of the most productive structures coming out, or sort of modes of thinking about identity coming out of Native studies, is a culture-based one, right? Like, which is actually kind of an ancestral understanding of community, right? It's like if you were raised in the community, you're a member of the community, bam, we're done. Race is a really modern concept in sort of a long modern historical definition. But I think one of the reasons that we should all study sort of the breadth of experience is like, there's no difference between the idea of blood quantum as a way of interpreting Native American identity and the sort of quadroon, octoroon, like
Yes.
parceling out of Black identity, right?
Yes.
Like this, the racialization of Native identity is really new. And it's being used to the exact opposite effect. But this is the perfect example of like, if we look at things from an intersectional perspective, or I mean, that's just basically a comparative perspective, right? It's not intersectional yet, but it could become intersectional if we start to use that knowledge to say different things. But like, yeah, on the one hand, you're trying to make everyone who's even a little bit Black. And on the other hand, you're trying to make everyone who's not completely Native non-Native, because of the way that resources are being structured by the people in power. But the idea that race is a real biological fact, like that's the same belief informing both those systems, right? And I know, like, for the Cherokee and others, like it was the Dawes rolls and not blood quantum that defines whether you were Cherokee. But it becomes like it's becoming the same systems of like, can you prove, I mean, the whole conversation of like, well, if you do a DNA test, can you prove you have Native blood? Like, what does that even mean? Like, people are misunderstanding how the science of DNA tests work, misinterpreting it. And there's this amazing Adrian Piper artwork to sort of change the subject, but not change the subject, where, because she's a philosopher as well as an artist, she just does this like very deadpan sort of takedown of like, everyone, according to these rules, everyone in America is Black. So like, move on. Like, what are you going to do with that information? Because what you learn is not that you're Black, right? It's that like, these are invented systems that are designed to keep you in your place and put you in a place and then keep you there or move you, right? Like the idea that the Cherokee freedmen, they're Cherokee and then they're not. And then, there have been lawsuits to say, actually, you are kind of legally. All of these kind of, like these are all basically like how, like what collective fiction are we going to agree on and why? And once you see it that way, it's like, okay, well, now we can intervene, right? Like, if we're just like, maybe let's stop using race, let's start using culture as a way to think about who we are. Then yeah, different conversations are possible. Which is not to say that we shouldn't think about race, because like, obviously, like it has been the fiction we've agreed on for hundreds of years. We have to talk about it. It's real socially,
Indeed.
Even if it's not real biologically. And that also like has to be part of how we're having this conversation.
Indeed. I mean, as you said, it's maybe a social construct, but unfortunately, it's a lived experience. I mean, America is a racialized society. So
yeah, exactly.
And people are racialized in different ways and in similar ways and different ways at the same time, as we mentioned about different types of oppressions. People have to be able to identify.
Like scary how persistent it is too, like in Native community, like in Oklahoma, a lot of people have incredibly mixed, like actual personal backgrounds. But there's just this hierarchy of kind of how Native do you look? And it's like, wow, like you could have been, raised in kind of like in the capital of the Choctaw Nation, and still like people will be like, no, you look white. Um, and it's just like it's so frustrating. But every community, I feel like you get these, every racialized community, I should say, you get these weird kind of phenotypical, um, hierarchies that are really destructive. And I think that too, like if you can look at that and be like, wow, we're doing this because of a system that someone else put on us to keep us down. Yeah.
Indeed. Now, if any of the audience members who are watching live have any questions, drop it in the chat, and we will address any appropriate questions. So just putting it out there. Now, I have a question, not to change pace, but we're going to change pace a little bit. Now, I noticed you are a professor of visual politics. So, what is exactly visual politics as a field of study for my students to understand?
Well, so I just got this job in May.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And when I got the job, I was a professor of art history at Oklahoma State. And when I got the job here in the UK, I learned that when you become a professor here, you get to make up your own title.
Awesome.
I know. And so I was like, oh, I could be professor of whatever I want. And I thought, I teach in an art school now, so it's a little different than teaching in an art history or American studies program, which is what I've done in the past. And I thought, okay, I'm in an art school. Like, how can I communicate to students what I do more specifically than art history, which is sort of, it sounds old fashioned and boring. And quite frankly, a lot of art history, it's still a little like, I think of myself as someone who studies visual culture more broadly. Like I'm as likely to talk about, well, like in the article, there's like photos from the Dakota Access protests, right? Like Standing Rock images are just as likely to show up in my work as kind of a painting. And then also like I work on a really wide range of things. So obviously I work on 20th century African and Native American material, but I also, I've worked on like 18th century British mezzotints and representations of gender. I work on contemporary lesbian photographers. Like I go kind of work all over the place. And so I wanted to find something that described what I do. And I realized that no matter what I talk about, I'm talking about it in terms of the social politics and in terms, if not of social justice movements, of kind of the potential for us to understand. I'm going to go back to this word that I've used a lot, of kind of marginalized experiences. And specifically, like, I don't think I do the kind of work where I'm just like, and then there were these marginalized people who were marginalized. Like I try to find the ways in which that experience is actually pushing back against our expectations for material. Like people are like, oh, well, like everyone talks about the coverage of Wounded Knee. I'm like, yeah, everyone talks about the coverage of Wounded Knee in the news, but no one's ever talked about how Black newspapers covered the American Indian movement. Like that means we haven't had that conversation properly yet, right? Like, I think, my most recent project is about sort of the intersection of lesbian and Navajo identity, and kind of thinking about like, why do those conversations happen in separate spaces? Like, that's weird. Because those people exist and like, have useful things to say.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I think art, I don't think I know, art is a vehicle to propel these conversations. That's why artists create art. and people don't realize that, each artist is a philosopher in essence, because it's some type of philosophy or an analysis they're trying to convey uh, through their art. I just remember how it was a brief moment of how people wanted to begin to engage the experiences of Native American veterans after the series of movies, Hollywood movies, Cold Talkers, what Flags of Our Father. I know one of them I wasn't too kindly a fan of, but that's fine. Clint Eastwood does great country western movies, but sometimes he does little cringy movies that try to deal with race. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
nonetheless, but there was, for a moment at least, increased and heightened conversations that even led to some recognition from the White House
Exactly.
and things of that nature. So, art definitely does play a significant role. And I hate when people say those things because they don't have no problem with I can get the dang on the lists of the new season of books being published in American history, African American history, or African history, my fields, and from these university presses that just clutters my faculty mailbox, and I'm gonna throw away 99.9% of them, recycle them actually, right? I'm like, how many damn books can y'all write about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, right? But no
Mhm.
one has a problem with that. But with
Right,
some,
exactly.
that's why someone say, "Oh, a lot of people's written about Wounded Knee." Like, well, okay, a lot of people. Until next year, we're gonna have 5 more damn books about Abraham Lincoln and
Mhm.
George Washington or John Adams or whatever the case may be, right? But no one has a problem with that. We got a million and a half books about the dang on Civil War.
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So it's further without people knowing it. Sometimes they are doing it unintentionally, but it's the further silencing and marginalization.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, and I think it goes right back to the point you made at the beginning about curiosity. And like, I think that while there's value to having obviously like shared frames of reference and like, it helps that you say Clint Eastwood and I know who you're talking about, right? Like
yeah.
we need to be able to have a conversation. But for me, the most exciting thing is like getting introduced to something new, something I didn't know about, just because I just started this job. We've been like trading books, me and all my colleagues now. And it's like, do you know this artist? And do you know that one? And have you read this? Um, and I think, in some, like, I mean, I was blatantly a diversity hire, which tells you something about how undiverse my department is. And I'm like, yeah, like, the problem that you hired me to solve, like, it's so obvious because literally I just like, I do it without thinking about it. But like every artist that someone has mentioned to me so far has been a man.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, you guys, like if this is, and like I say, you guys advisedly, like if this is what you're teaching students, like, yeah, this is exactly why. Like, I don't want to suggest that we all just study kind of who we are.
Indeed.
I think it's really actually quite problematic that we're like, oh, we need to diversify our faculty. So I guess we'll hire someone in African American studies. Like, really? Why couldn't you hire a Black person who studies Chinese art history? Like, this isn't actually like, we're not all stuck doing what we identify as. Although I have to say that seems, well, it's obviously like Black power, red power. It's not what I do all the time, although I do sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea of like, just if we all knew different things. So because I remember my dissertation advisor saying to me about my dissertation, like, you're not going to get anywhere if you don't include some famous people.
Wow, that
I
speaks.
know.
Art.
I was like, but I'm not really interested in famous people. Like, that is in fact my entire point, is that there are these really overlooked people who are just as sort of interesting and important and brilliant artists and like the only reason we haven't looked at them is because culturally we're kind of jerks.
Yes.
And so like, no, the point is to have those stories. Like you cannot understand American modernism if you always only talk about those four artists. So yeah, I mean, I feel like this is also part of the visual politics, right? Is like, yeah, I'm never going to be writing the book about George Washington.
Indeed. Neither will I. I might write it about some of his slaves or some of the indigenous Americans' land that he came to occupy, or I wouldn't write a book about Thomas Jefferson, but I might write one about his great great grandfather that everyone forgot. But the racists reminded him about it in the newspapers, calling him an orangutan and things of that nature, trying
Yeah,
to
exactly.
racialize him, right, to drum up support because of some Native American ancestry that they allege that he may or may not have had or whatnot. But no, indeed not. It's so troubling because I mean that's the struggle we see across academia internationally. So in the U.S., obviously it sounds that way in Europe, in the U.K. As well. I have friends in Canada who teach, and they've expressed similar types of things. I mean, we say things, and it's so true. Like, when they want to diversify faculty, right? They hire someone in Black studies or women in gender studies or et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, man, it's so we end up being isolated, or the
Yeah.
potential runs very high to become isolated in these spaces, and that doesn't help to retain faculty at
No, exactly.
so it's like a terrible, like it's like being a hamster on a treadmill, in many ways. And I think that's why a lot of institutions have trouble with retention and have a revolving door. If you look at some of the job posting websites or whatnot that, academics look at, it seems like, man, every 3 or 4 years, that school is hiring for the same job.
Mhm.
It's like, oh man, it's happening.
Well, and I think it's so interesting, every now and then institutions have the opportunity to do like cluster hires where they can hire 3 or 4 people at once.
Yes.
And I'm like, that never gets used in ways that would foster a sense of community, right? Like, I mean, Oklahoma State, they did like a pandemic cluster hire where it was like, we want people who work on pandemics. And I'm like, this is like a bizarre thing to be spending money on when we've done like multiple faculty surveys that say, Indigenous studies could use some faculty support, or, I mean, God forbid, African American studies gets any support. That was a really, really, I think, tough conversation to have at OSU, even though I think they thought they were trying. I mean, they invested a lot in the idea of diversity. And as you're saying, they're like, but we don't understand why we can never retain faculty. And I'm like, because we're all lonely as heck. Like,
Exactly. Exactly. And depending on where the institution is, it may or may not even be a community uh,
mhm,
for, these faculty members outside of the institution to help sustain them. So they feel isolated at work, at home, and eventually they're going to say, hey,
yeah,
go somewhere where I can find a community. And I think cluster hires are definitely helpful. I mean, we've seen it in my field. So I've seen it at Penn State. I've seen it at
mhm,
the University of Kentucky. I've seen it at many, many places. And I think schools that want to start a new program, be Native American or American Indian studies or African American studies, they should do a cluster hire. Because
yeah,
hiring one person, because then it develops the issue of, are the students minoring in that person?
yeah, well, exactly.
Is that the only voice they're going to get in the field?
Yeah.
within that particular discipline, because I view Black Studies as a discipline and not just a field. I'm a historian and a Black Studies scholar. I have both PhDs, right? But no one would say, you know, clearly, right, I'm a historian and my field is African American history, right? But
Mm.
so Black Studies, we have a methodology.
I was gonna say there's method theory that backs it up. Yeah, yeah, like American studies and absolutely
Indeed.
studies too. Yeah.
And I could see so maybe I could broaden and say cultural studies as a discipline or whatever, right? I would have no problem with that because I see and I know the history of how, these things, came about. And a lot of people who do African American studies got their PhDs, their training in American studies or ethnic studies. Some got it in Latinx studies because they focus on Afro Latinos and et cetera, et cetera. So, cultural
Yeah.
stuff. Institutes. And I believe that we need a new generation of young scholars who are encouraged, trained, and supported to be able to focus in on some of these intersectional issues in areas that we've discussed here. I mean, it's so much more. And that's why I'm so grateful. And I'm going to be quite honest with you. It isn't always easy for me when it comes August and I got to think about what I'm going to do in the fall. And I'm like, Native American, because it is a Black Studies webinar,
Yeah.
right? So I understand my positionality, right? And so I scour looking for scholarship and reach
Yeah.
out to those scholars. And it's not as much as you would hope that exists, that it's.
No. Yeah. And I think, I mean, you could do a meta analysis of that, right? Because I do think that, I mean, it has served, I mean, I'm going to sound like I think there's some like big brother sort of thing, but it serves the status quo for sure to keep all of those disciplines siloed, right? Like, and I just like institution after institution, I'm like, okay, so like I'm affiliate faculty in women's studies, Native American studies. Sometimes like at OSU, I was teaching African American art history. So Africana studies. Um, we had a thing that was like local studies. So like that too. And I'm like, okay, why? Like I'm now in 5 different programs. Like this is an illusion.
Yeah.
Our women's studies department had 1 faculty member and like often a bunch of adjuncts and things like that. But I'm like, when you said majoring in a person, like, yeah, that's what people end up doing. And that like, but there's like 5 of those 1 people.
Yes.
Because like the way that and I think, partly it's an accident and partly it's like no one cares enough to fix it who's at a high enough level administratively. But by keeping those 5 people separate, you're making something that's actually powerful and reaching a lot of students, like you said, kind of cultural studies, if we want to use that umbrella. You're making it look like not enough people care.
Yes.
And I think again, that's like a political issue for faculty, right? Is how do we have that conversation differently? But yeah, like a survey of the literature of like how many articles are there that look cross-disciplinarily at cultural history would be really enlightening, I think.
Indeed. It's a potential idea for a student out there or or whoever, right? No, but
Yeah, well, it'd be a great master's thesis.
it certainly would be. It certainly would be, particularly at a place like Western Carolina University. Right, with in the region with the African American and
Yeah,
Cherokee populations, it would make sense certainly that a student would come along and say, "Hey, I'm interested in that." And something else I ran into is and this as a scholar, there's waves, right? So there was a mini wave that like 10, 15 years ago, right? So reaching out to them, and many of them scholars say, "Man, that was 10 years ago. I don't want to talk about that." And,
right.
and then they'll say, "Oh, well, look at my CV and pick something new." And then I have that uncomfortable, well, will I send this email and say, because I don't want them to take it the wrong way, that I'm not interested in that other stuff. I'm interested this. That's why I reached out to you for this particular, thing, this
Yeah,
article or book that you wrote, and that's something else that I faced, and those of us, right? We've done historiography, or review of the literature, but you having a history background as well, right? We've had historiography classes, and we see how it happens in waves and things of that
yeah,
nature,
exactly.
and all of that. So I would love to see a new wave of young folks doing more of that, interdisciplinary and intersectional approaches to to marginalized groups in freedom and equality struggles,
Yeah.
in societies,
I
particularly.
do think it's really, I mean, it is inspiring to me how many young people are, at least in literally in the intersection of Native and Black, um, like how many people are coming forward and claiming both of those
Yeah,
identities and cultures, and saying like, because I mean, historically, basically people have been forced to choose one or the other, I think, and kind of like, how are you going to identify? You just get one culture.
hmm,
And America is changing and the world is changing. But I think also our interest in sort of a complete, like allowing people to be their complete selves, like
yeah.
that is something that also gives me optimism. I think that that is becoming more true. And maybe, I mean, in the book that I'm working on now, I make the argument that all historians are fundamentally autobiographers on some level. Um, and maybe as people are allowed to kind of be their whole selves, they'll start writing histories about that. And you will get your wave. I would love that.
I would too. Yes, yes. History students, hear that. All students, yes. Because I try to tell them, I'm saying, hey, this is the type of analysis when you're trying to analyze a book. I'm like, that's why the thesis and the methodology and their analytical paradigms are important, because so who they are, when you get assigned a book in the course, yes, Google that scholar, look at their bio,
Yeah.
look at their profile. Where are they from? Like, it means something that I write and have published. Basically, all of my publications thus far have been on Detroit, right? That means something because
Yeah.
I am from the Detroit metropolitan area, right? So, that's right. It's a reason that it's on, they've been on Black Power movement and Black Studies movement, right? I
Hmm.
Black Studies major as an undergrad, right? My direct relatives were very active in the Black Power movement, in Detroit and in Lowndes County, Alabama. Like, it's a reason, right? Yeah. So it's very much for many of us, very much enterprise in some form of autobiography, at the very least, and people, young people, undergraduates, I should say. I think they need to become more aware of that and engage, and because I
Mhm.
think something that we train students to do, so it's a hidden skill that in the time where everyone says college is a scam or whatever kind they've fallen victim to lead them to that absurd conclusion, right? Now we could talk about student loans and cost of tuition. That's a different conversation. But the notion
Yeah.
a university or a collegiate education is a scam, but is what not just critical thinking, which is central, but also what evaluation of sources. And
Mm.
right now in American society, the lack of ability to analyze a source has been extremely detrimental to our politics of recent, you know,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah, I mean, well, and again, like structures, right? Like I think, as you say, people like we have to make a distinction between education. When we think about, people with that rhetoric of kind of, oh, like the founding fathers and what did they want? Like, you know what, the right to an education
Mhm.
is a founding ideal in the US. And that right has been taken away by the financial structures that have been allowed to come into place, right? Like, I mean, Oklahoma State was a land grant university, is a land grant university. Like now it gets less than a fifth of its budget from public funds.
Mhm.
Land grant universities were invented to make education accessible to everybody, like public schools at every level. And
Yeah.
I think it is a travesty of the whole concept of American democracy, American society. Like, you could be as kind of conservative as you want in terms of the ideals on which the nation was founded. Like, education is a part of that. And as we acknowledge the humanity of every, like, it is, I think, the distribution of wealth, it's a way of denying people their humanity. And I could go on and I won't, but
Oh,
um,
that's prior to coming to
I
Western
think,
Cape. Yeah.
yeah, no, but people who are being persuaded that college is a waste of time and the academics are all kind of just trying to brainwash people. Um, that's a scam designed to keep people uneducated. It's transparent in a way, but when you tuck in the $50,000 price tag,
Yeah.
it's an easy lie to believe.
Certainly. And I'm glad you mentioned land grant institutions, the moral act, and all these things. It's a reason that some of those most pioneering state institutions were land grant schools, like a Penn State, like a Michigan State University. It's a reason, you see it culturally, but people don't pay attention. It's the reason why the big game, my team lost. University of Michigan versus Michigan State, right? But across a lot of the old school fandom, right? It's the University of Michigan kids are elites.
Yeah.
And Michigan State kids, the people who actually go to these schools and not just fans of the sports teams, are what working class kids, right? It goes back to that notion of land grants. And so many of the HBCUs that are state schools and had always been state schools, founded as state schools, were founded under, as land grant institutions. And you say, well, why this HBCU is struggling and it's a state school? Because the reduction of that public funds going to land grant institutions, and we're now overly relying on endowments and private donors.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he or she who controls the purse strings controls the destiny. That's really a reality. And I tell you, I see it here in the state of North Carolina. Before I came to Western, I was at a historically Native American institution, University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and it's growing, and it's growing and being able to expand by donations, endowments, and then large increase in African American student enrollment. But however, in the community, it has caused a lot of tension.
Yeah.
Right. And that leads to unnecessary confrontation and discourse. Because then students respond, well, this school would be closed if we didn't come because we're spending the money. The doors would have been shuttered. If that's what y'all want and we all leave, we give y'all 5 years before you have to close the doors.
Yeah.
And it's all these tensions kind of bringing the circle almost back. The conversation 90 degrees back, now full circle though. But as we begin to wind down and wrap up, quickly, in this field of what we were talking about, this intersections of marginalized groups and approaching research in that way, particularly using art or whatever, what would be some recommendations or some things that you think students might be able to explore that hasn't been researched enough, or there's opportunities for students to, because it's always a struggle. Students, they always ask, I don't know what to research.
Yeah.
I don't know what to research. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think, like you were saying, like, there is so much more to be said about the intersections of Black and Native history, just in general. There has been a fair amount of scholarship. And this is the other thing is, like I said before, I was affiliated with the Center for Oklahoma Studies, kind of local studies program. And so much of that history is dismissed as local and regional. So a lot of the work that's been done in the intersection of Black and Native history is sort of in Oklahoma studies. And I feel like people never see those. You were talking about getting like listed books in your mailbox, which we all get as faculty, but like we don't get the little ones from Oklahoma and Kansas, and like we get Yale endlessly, it seems like.
Like, man,
You
how
can
many
see
damn
who
books
has
have
the
you read?
budget.
Yes. To waste all that money.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, students like, well, and then the autobiography thing, right? I think look at yourself, like ask yourself how is the history of who I am more complicated than I think it is? And I don't mean that literally, like who am I? But I remember, like, I think one of the reasons I was attracted to this kind of idea of marginalized people is because I had this kind of prolonged experience of coming out where I was like, I'm not sure what I am, right? And then I said like this sort of immigrant experience that was almost invisible because I immigrated as a kid and look and sound like the most ordinary kind of white American, and yet was experiencing a lot of culture shock for like the first 10 years that I lived in the States.
Yeah.
And so I was fascinated by this kind of invisible outsiderness in myself, but also like learned how to negotiate that from people who didn't have as much choice, I think. I mean, I'm not sure that's not an uncomplicated thing to say, that I could choose to kind of pass as whatever. I mean, yeah, long history, like the concept of passing. Let's talk about a thing that we could really dive into, right? But yeah, like finding histories. And so, I mean, I came over to the UK during the pandemic, and so was stuck in a house by myself for like 6 months, not allowed to go anywhere. And I just started researching like British lesbian newspapers because that's what was online and available, right? And I had all this time and research leave with like no access to my archives. And I was like, well, I have access to this archive. And like, in some ways, that's my history. In other ways, I'm like, I know nothing about like sexuality studies in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot about it in America because I'm an Americanist and that's what I have studied. But it was just this new world to me. And again, it's that sort of letting chance play a role in how I pick things, but also just kind of being like, well, what's broadly interesting to me, or like, what is that part of me? And then I think, like I said before, just looking at everything, like I am, when I was at Oklahoma State, I used to teach a survey class, and I would ask my students on the first day, like, how many of you have been to an art museum? Because they weren't art history majors, like it was just kind of anyone who wanted to take it. And only 2 or 3 people ever raised their hands. So I was like, okay, like good, because we're doing field trips, right? Like we are going, I don't even care if it's like, Oklahoma, turns out, has more museums per capita than any other state, allegedly.
Oh,
There are all these tiny museums. It's like someone's living room. They turned it into a museum and it counts. So we have like 500 museums and not that many people. And so I was like, I don't care what kind of museum you go to, we're going to go to one so that you have that experience of like ask yourself, like, why do people collect things? My other favorite thing I used to do with my students is like, who like, were like, well, we don't know anything about collecting or art because I taught museum studies. It's like, you have someone in your family who's a collector.
yes.
Figure out who it is. Tell me about what they collect. Interview them. I love oral history as a research tool. And it was like, interview them about their collection. I guarantee you will learn something about them you did not know. And that's really interesting, right? Like everywhere you look is a research project, especially if you're a historian, right? Like, look at your house and be like, what don't I know about this house? I've always wanted to do a class where you just pick a building and do like the deep dive of every bit of its history and who was there.
Indeed.
I love that kind of project.
Yeah, no, indeed. And you will they will be amazed how much that they will learn, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Migration patterns, changes in
Mm-hmm.
demographics, changing social economic status of communities, all type of stuff. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, coming from Detroit,
Yes,
How's
exactly.
that?
Exactly. Well, awesome. Uh, so thank you for talking with us. I'm going to give just a few more minutes with a filler question for someone to pose a question if they're so inclined. And this is totally off topic, but I am just so curious. So the UK has finally done something that I never think it would ever do, and it's taken so long. They have a Punjabi prime minister.
Oh yeah.
It's
Yeah,
history.
we do.
Indeed, indeed. I know, not barring which slant he leans towards, but
Well, exactly.
yeah. So for some people, it may not be a celebration, but just the notion of, uh, how has the media covered that there? Have they covered it in that particular historical context?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so here the I guess the coverage, well, literally here. So I'm in Winchester, which is like South England. But it's also where Rishi Sunak is from.
Mm.
In a completely weird story, my landlord was over the other day, possibly just yesterday, and it was the first time we'd met in person. We talked on the phone, but we'd never met. And like within 10 minutes, he's pulling his phone out because he lives next door to Rishi Sunak's parents. So it's like, look at this photo of me with Rishi Sunak, and I'm like, I don't know how to respond to this. My landlord, I think, is Egyptian.
Okay.
Sunak, obviously, I mean, British, but as you say, like our first, yeah, possibly any minority.
Oh, certainly.
Prime minister. I'm
Oh,
like,
certainly that. I wanted to say non-white person, but I was.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, he went to school like literally a block away from my apartment here. So there's been like this incredible local coverage of like, but then also really entertainingly because his politics are so right wing. I
Yeah.
mean, not compared to American right wing politics, but still pretty bad. Um, and so there's this conflict of like, on the one hand, we're really proud he's from here. On the other hand, we're kind of embarrassed that he's from here. And people are like, let's not underscore that too much. Like Winchester just elected its first non-conservative member of parliament in like 30 years last year. So we're like a community that's teetering on the brink of like, maybe we're going to go a little to the left. Maybe this will be good. And now it's like, no. But also, I mean, I have to say, I've been surprised at how, I mean, I think Liz Truss was elected first 100% because racism.
Yeah.
You know, like she was off the wall. Her policies were insane. She's a terrible leader.
Yeah.
He came across as thoughtful, intelligent, kind of reasonable in his policies. You know, I mean, I think it really bears repeating that the right wing here is basically the left wing in America, and the left wing here is like the Communist Party in America. Like it's skewed pretty far. But having said that, like Liz Truss was like, she was like American style right wing. I mean, like, let's never tax the rich ever. Like, I'm sorry, no, like let's actually tax billionaires who won't even notice because we like can't turn that heat on. Like,
Hey, we talk about public education, right?
yeah, well, exactly. I mean, it is yeah, it's really sad for my parents. Going to college was entirely free. And now students here, they pay basically $10,000 a year. And yeah, I mean, you could imagine the average salary in this country is only about $30,000. And so like, that's just out of reach for most people. On the other hand, they have a loan forgiveness program that is far more generous than the US. I think if your salary never makes it up to a certain level, you just don't ever have to pay it back. So we're not, yeah, we're not in quite as much trouble. But I think if I could change one thing in the world, it would be to make college education free.
Indeed. That and healthcare for me. Yes.
Oh yeah, that too. Oh my God, that is a blessing here. Yeah.
Indeed, indeed. Talking about intersectionalities of poor Black, Brown, Indigenous communities in the USA. Boy, well,
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to stop because we haven't received any additional questions. Well, thank you so much. I think this was a very good conversation, a lot that people can learn from. I think it gave people who are interested in doing research a lot of ideas and frameworks to begin to do that. I think it also serves as a space where maybe we can develop further of that African American and American Indian Native American solidarity and cooperation as opposed to animosity, for lack of a better way to put it. So thank you
Yeah,
so
thank you
much.
so much for having me. Yeah.
Pleasure is mine. On behalf of Western Carolina University, the Global Black Studies Program, and our region, thank you, Dr. Siddons, for speaking with us and taking your time to share your expertise. And you have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
You too. Thank you so much. It was great to meet you. I hope we speak again soon.
Yes, ma'am. My pleasure.